name is Pamela Katic. I'm a researcher at the University of Greenwich. Just a few very quickly housekeeping rules. You are welcome to keep your camera on, but if you'd like to turn it off, you can do so as well, and perhaps put it back on if you want to make a contribution. Feel free to leave your comments and questions on the chat, but you can also raise your hand if later on you want to come in and give us your question. The session is being recorded, as you just heard. And anything else? What? No. Well, we have 40 minutes, just how the session will run. We'll have 2-minute speeches from our panelists, and they already posted very interesting contributions on the conference program. I hope you had time to go over them. After those speeches, we are going to open the floor for some quick questions, and then we are going to have a roundtable discussion around different aspects of Indigenous and non-Indigenous research partnerships, and we're going to close. Just to say that we have a follow-up session right after this with other panelists, so you're welcome to join us as well on the next session. Okay, so very quickly, as mode of introduction, I just want to remind us that the aim of this panel is to support Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers planning research collaborations to reflect about their methods, their assumptions, and their behavior. And we have a number of very interesting speakers today that have voluntarily and very kindly agreed to come to the floor and share their experiences and their understandings of Indigenous and non-Indigenous research partnerships, what has worked for them, what hasn't worked, and reflect on opportunities for fruitful and equitable partnerships in the future. So I really hope you enjoyed this session. And yeah, without further ado, we'll start with the 2-minute speeches. So Tanya is here, great, Tanya Sen. So I'm gonna just raise my hand when we're very close to the 2 minutes. So please, let's try to keep it on time because we have a very, very short session. Thanks everyone. So Tanya, over to you for your 2-minute speech. Thank you.
Right, hi, thank you, Pamela. So hello everyone, my name is Tanya Sen, and the paper I'm going to present is titled Redefining Knowledge Production. And so basically it's a theoretical paper, and I'm asking 3 basic questions in my paper. So the first question I'm asking is, how do we implement the non-Indigenous ideas to an Indigenous setting? And here we see a trend of overgeneralization and looking at Indigenous people as a homogeneous category. So I'm questioning if that is fair and if that's what we are supposed to do. And I'm also discussing the problems that it leads to when we look at them as a homogeneous category. The second question I'm asking is about this thing called desire for modernity, which in my study, which I've not included in the paper, but I did a study where I found that the Indigenous people also have a tendency to modernize. And so I'm asking, what is this desire or tendency to modernize themselves? The third question or the third problem that I'm dealing with is that how do we decolonize these generalizations and this looking at the Indigenous people as an exotic category? So these ideas are these ideas have their origin in differences and separation and categorization into fixed box. So how do we overcome that kind of a thing, and how do we decolonize these categories? So yeah, that's what my paper is about. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And leaving us more time. Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. And next is Sarah Radcliffe, please.
Hello, everybody. I presented a PowerPoint presentation which summarized a research project that I undertook with Indigenous women in Ecuador about a decade ago, or it finished a decade ago. And the paper really was grappling with the issue that, for me, coloniality and colonial relations underpin all research and research partnerships. And that for me, as a white researcher based in a Western university, the issue is about working hard to try and mitigate that coloniality in the best way possible. So I tracked the sort of research cycle that I was undertaking with the Indigenous women, and positive components of that, which aim to decolonize the research relationship, were issues around my long-standing connection with Indigenous organizations in the country, which allowed me very good links into the women's representatives elected for the National Confederation, and then back down to regional representatives. Also, decolonizing elements involved the recognition that the proposals from those representatives for the methodology were much more appropriate than the ones that I had undertaken. And finally, that the women made sure that I was listening to their words and their frameworks as the major way in which we interacted. But there were still very many colonial dimensions to this, related to the fact that the second group that I was working with had a very patriarchal organizational structure and society, which made it much more difficult for me to interact with women in a more systematic way. And that is a function of the way in which certain patriarchal cultures have evolved in those societies. The second aspect, I think, is also important, which is that the coloniality of the authorship of the work that came out of that was also very marked by coloniality. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Sarah. Next, we have a team of Sonia Reutemann, Jim Walker, and Raina Harrison, who co-presented, and it was great to see that. So I don't know who wants to talk now.
Yeah, that'll be me. I'm going to do the sum. So our research focuses on what are meaningful research partnerships with First Nations peoples. And in Australia, the nature of collaborations with Indigenous communities, the challenges and elements that facilitate and constrain cooperation all influence the strength and outcomes of partnerships. So our analysis from the data so far reveals a legacy of settler colonialism that is there in Australia in any kind of engagement with Indigenous peoples. And so in building research partnerships, researchers have to recognize the historical and current impact of the power imbalance. And the data so far also shows a growing acceptance among researchers that meaningful partnerships should be addressing and even trying to rectify the impacts of settler colonialism, but that the institutions themselves, the universities and research institutions, are often lagging behind in the best practice there. So there is a general feeling that institutional processes don't fully encompass the needs of both the researchers and the communities to build meaningful relationships, but more flexibility has to be built into the protocols that are set up. So also some of the actions that are taken by institutions that try to officially provide more inclusive programs that focus on reconciliation have often been criticized as being tokenistic, that you just tick a box that says that you did engagement rather than actually providing the desired outcomes. So the researchers themselves seem to be often following through on the best practice in spite of the obstacles from the institutions, but more analysis does need to be done to determine how processes may need to be overhauled to promote more inclusive partnerships that can meet both the needs of the research institutions and the Indigenous communities as well. Thank you.
Very excellent. Thank you very much, Raina. So now we have some minutes for a Q&A, specifically on the contributions of our panelists. So
did you want, sorry, Pam, did you want me to?
Oh, sorry. Oh,
I was
dear.
like, oh my goodness, did I get something wrong?
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm just jumping. I'm very conscious of time and I'm just jumping. Sorry. Yes, please.
No worries. No worries. Okay, I'll hit the ground running then. So with our paper, we used the results of information from 54 Indigenous and non-Indigenous and their business leaders and their contributions to our Indigenous Community Corporate Partnership Study. And out of that, we concluded that there are 9 interconnected leadership competencies key to creating and sustaining meaningful, and in this case, that means relationship-based partnerships. Foremost among these is the requirement that partners demonstrate a personal commitment to establishing relationships with community that extends beyond the needs of the business the sort of business structure or the project itself. Individuals who are willing to be vulnerable, self-reflexive and responsive are most successful at establishing these meaningful partnerships. And researchers have some advantages over business leaders, especially with regard to our ability to develop longer-term relationships with communities that have that has some institutional support that doesn't always happen in a corporate environment. But we all have some distance to go, and Indigenous business leaders and scholars cite specifically the need for researchers to kind of move away from quote unquote learning about Indigenous people to learning from Indigenous peoples. And Kwakwaka'wakw scholar, education scholar Corey Wilson captures this in her oft repeated statement of nothing about us without us. So truly equitable partnerships that redistribute power in meaningful ways are not yet happening, at least in a Canadian context, but there are signs that partnerships are moving in this direction. And a lot will depend on the willingness of those currently in power to see the benefits of relinquishing what currently amounts to their kind of veto-making decision-making power, to move toward partnerships where decisions are negotiated and benefits are both distributed and accrued in equitable and meaningful ways. So yeah, that's my 2 minutes.
Great, thanks a lot, Tanya. Sorry about that again. Okay, yeah, so now nobody else in my list. So if anyone from the audience wants to raise their hand, or any of the other panelists wants to ask a question or convene us, the floor is open. We have a few minutes. Okay. Alternatively, let's just jump into the roundtable discussion. So we have
Jim has his hand up. I think Jim just put his hand up.
Yep.
I had it up very briefly, just to test it. But now, because we're going to move into a roundtable discussion, I'll save it for then. Thanks.
Okay. Not a problem.
Okay, should I start off with the roundtable?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I mean, one of the themes that we're sort of trying to explore in both of our sessions is what do we mean by a good partnership? I mean, and how might we find ways to identify the ingredients that make this a good relationship? One of the things that came through was just the understanding about context, how important historical, political, and place-based contexts are. And, you know, to really have an understanding of that, sometimes you need deep relationships. Sarah, that comes through in your paper very strongly. You know, some of what you've done is building on many years of engagement. And I suppose one question is, it's not always possible to have that history of engagement. And how can a new relationship, maybe let's take the example of the corporate engagement. Often the corporations don't have that history of engagement with Indigenous communities, that depth and historical context, but might be well-meaning, might be wanting to make these good relationships. What are the sort of ways in which one can overcome some of those barriers? And I'm just throwing that in for anyone, particularly our four presenters, if you want to reflect on that question.
I mean, I can jump in from the sort of corporate side of things. I think that when talking to these business leaders that had sort of created successful partnerships, key to that was really understanding their own sort of mutual goals around a business opportunity. So starting off from a place that's co-constituted, that isn't just, the corporation coming in and saying, hey, isn't this a great idea? Right? But rather the community and the corporation kind of meeting, a meeting of like minds. And so that seems to be really important. And certainly from a researcher perspective, which is my other hat, kind of doing more of the academic research, that same principle seems to apply. So if the community is coming to me and saying, we're really interested in understanding the impacts that this transportation corridor is going to have on our elk population, then it just gives you a springboard that's already has legitimacy within the community. So.
Sonia?
Yes, thank you. So maybe just to give you some indication of what we have found so far, and maybe if there is someone who hasn't seen the presentation, just to say that we have been interviewing people who work with Indigenous communities, and those researchers could be Indigenous or non-Indigenous, because we were also trying to find out where there were differences based on that. And the reality was that in most cases, whether they were Indigenous or non-Indigenous, they always acknowledged that it was nearly impossible to do research without any prior connections with communities. And even if there were topics, because we ask a lot about who sets up the agenda, who decides on topics. And we had both, in some cases, but a minority of people who had their own topics, either because it was funded related or for different reasons, but they didn't have the opportunity to have major discussions about the topics with the communities. But even in those cases, they had already some sort of prior relationships with communities. And in relation to something that was mentioned already by Rina, but also other presentations, was that everyone acknowledged that it was also what it was expected to do, that we want to go away from these extractive practices of researchers just going into the field and disappearing or just having their own agenda. But at the same time, the major difficulty was that even if researchers were very conscious of that, the structure, the research system or whatever it was not supporting that. And so timing was very different. And also in relation to the outputs, again, it was, as Tanya was mentioning, yes, there were some people who were very explicit about, well, we kind of negotiate outcomes, or there are many outcomes that are based on communities, but the reality is that those don't really count for sponsors or universities, because it's not a publication or it's not a report, and it's just a video or, like a letter for the community. And so it was more how they could be negotiating that sort of process, knowing that probably half of what they achieved is not recognized by the universities or whatever the system is.
Sarah?
Yes, I thought I would just mention that it seems to me important that these prior connections with an Indigenous group have to we also have to remember that the structures of power and difference within an Indigenous population mean that the nature of the connections that we might have as non-Indigenous researchers or partners is also going to play a factor in the degree to which that a connection can then translate into a wider partnership which supports research and other collaborations and so on. And I think that having some degree of prior connection and knowledge of the sort of historic and institutional and political context within which one has those prior connections also plays a role.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you. I think that just picking up from what Sarah was saying, just now. I think that the idea of building that relationships, I think somewhere along the line, when you're starting to contemplate development of a project, you've got to build in within your project timeline the time to build relationships, and we're not talking about an extra day or a week. We're actually talking about, and if you don't have that time, then I think that your project will falter, because, again, from I guess what Sarah was talking about, was that you will get factional disputes within Indigenous communities, and it's just like we have, like there is in mainstream populations. And so building that time to build relationships to see who's who and who has the authority to speak is certainly worthwhile, and if not, even engaging a cultural broker. The other thing that I guess what I was going to talk about before is I'm chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee for Earthwatch Australia, and what I'm now getting them to do is look at projects to when a project comes to us for funding, and if it involves Indigenous communities, I want to see some sort of statement as to how that will meet how it complies with the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I spoke about that within our presentation in our video, but also how does it comply with the Nagoya Protocol, the Article 8J of the Convention on Biological Diversity? Because if we can show that, then at least we know that those who are seeking funding from us then are aware of such rights, and doing it from a rights-based approach, I think, gives strength to Indigenous communities, and also rather than from a deficit approach. So it means that they go to the table saying that these are our rights, and when we start to report on those and then build that evaluation into those projects. But I think that if we can start doing that, and also show funders or sponsors of our research that this is what we are making sure the UN, that these projects are going to be UN compliant with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and compliant with the Nagoya Protocol.
Thank you, Jim. And that starts to bring us towards some of these sort of broader institutional questions that I know that the panel will want to talk about later. I have Tanya Hoffman. I also have a specific question for you, Sarah, in the chat. Tanya, why don't you go first? And then Sarah, you can have a minute to think about the question that's been asked in the chat and maybe respond to that.
Sure. I just thinking about and people talking about long-term relationships with Indigenous communities and kind of what those can produce. And in reflecting, I myself have had a relationship similar to Sarah with a single community for about 25 years now. And what I've discovered is the longer that I maintain this relationship, the more I'm required to embrace discomfort. And so I think that's a really interesting outcome. So I have now deeply personal relationships with individuals in the community who now feel, I don't know if safe is the right word, but feel enabled to ask me very increasingly difficult questions about why I do what I do, and the sort of personal reasons that are driving my work. And that is actually something that came out in these corporate business partnerships, that one of the real requirements for successful business partnerships within Indigenous communities was for the business partner to be able to be vulnerable, personally vulnerable, to show up as individuals to that conversation and to that partnership. So I'm just curious and wanted to kind of throw that out and see if that reflects anybody else's experience as well.
Thank you, Tanya. Sarah, the question is from Joe Howard, and I think it picks up on a comment that I think Pamela has made in her comments on the panel around maybe intersectionality, thinking about these things in intersectional ways, but specifically about the links between colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism, and how we might address them.
Yeah. Yes, thanks for the question. It's an incredibly broad and important question. But in terms of the context of this panel, I think that, yes, I would stress that a sort of intersectional approach that looks at people's differential positioning in gender hierarchies that have been shaped in different ways around the world to have different outcomes for differently positioned women and men, and in socioeconomic terms, and in terms of relationships with the state and politics, you know, around citizenship. We always are faced with a very differentiated, very heterogeneous society with very complex relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous actors. And I think that as an academic researcher, and this would be different perhaps for other people across the panel, as an academic researcher, I think it's incumbent on me to recognize that even the sort of social categories that we're using, such as Indigenous or whatever, are very complex and very vulnerable to change and changing meanings and so on. And hence, you know, and even in our relationship, as Tanya was just saying, really interestingly, you know, in our relationships, what indigeneity means to us as researcher is being challenged all the time through our engagement, and being vulnerable to that, but also recognizing that it's just incredibly you know, it opens up all of these new ways of thinking about the world, which I think is the other side of that discomfort, and you know, what I think is a very welcome moment of researchers and partners feeling discomfort in those relationships that they're trying to establish with Indigenous people. So I haven't done justice to the whole question, but hopefully I've kind of brought it back into our panel themes.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Tanya Martinez-Cruz, who is our co-convener on the panel, just to facilitate the next bit of the conversation.
Before I jump to the next question, I wanted to react to something that Tanya Hopman said, because I'm thinking of my own community and how some researchers come and do research. There's one experience that I recall pretty much. It's from an anthropologist from the Free University of Berlin. And she's been working with my community for over 25 years. She's interested in seeing how people like to portray themselves using visual media. And with all the migration, that's a tool that is commonly used for people in my community that has migrated to be connected and see how things are evolving, but also, like, I guess, to have this sense of belonging and being part of the community. I don't think she was asked anything particularly, because people welcome her. But at one point she was asked, in terms, we're talking about good collaboration, she was asked to perform some of the rituals and do some of the donations in the way that any person of my community does. And it wasn't linked to research, it wasn't linked to endorses a letter, it was more like, we want you to offer an award because she volunteered herself, but people says you shouldn't say that so loosely if you're not willing to. But it was even beyond that. She had to perform the rituals in the sacred places of my community because that was part of belonging. And then she was like, but how do I'm supposed to be doing this if I'm not an Indigenous person like you? And then the community told her, but you're living here, and part of acknowledging that you are in our territory and that work closely with us, it's having to do a normal life like we do. So it wasn't so much staying you as a researcher, but moving to be part of the community in a way. So I find that sometimes I don't know if it's a matter of time restriction or where we position, where we're sitting, but I don't see that many people is willing to do that. And I think some of the most fruitful relationships that I've seen of researchers working with communities linked to that, not necessarily with something to research, but something that the community really values within the norms and ways of interacting. So I don't know if any of you been confronted with that, but to me, it's just interesting to see how some researchers move into that area and they have a different partnership beyond just research. Sorry, Bhaskar, I think I pushed to stay in the question. I don't know if you want to continue the facilitation.
No. I'm handing over to you to facilitate as well.
Reina, go ahead, and then we move to the next question. Sorry.
In regards to that idea of trust building that you brought up, there's in Indigenous communities in Australia, for researchers, there's often an expectation, especially before you have built up that long-term relationship, even after you've built up that long-term relationship, that you are going to participate in the daily life of the community that you're in, or that you're going to help the community in their daily life in order to kind of prove your trustworthiness or prove your intentions, or show that you are committed to building this relationship with them. So it's either doing your interviews or something like that while you're doing the daily tasks of the community or of the participants, or it's proving that you will do those things. Like, before I allow you to interview me, first we're going to go do this. First you're going to drive me out here because I don't have a car. First you're going to take me to the store. First you're going to help my auntie do XYZ. And that is kind of an accepted part of building that relationship and building that trust before you're allowed to participate, to do the research, or to become part of the community, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, and actually that connects pretty well to the next question that we have. Pamela, I think we have like 15 minutes left in this session, or how long do we have before I jump to the question, so we see what's going to be
actually we only have 7, but just go ahead and we'll carry on the discussion in the next session.
Do we need to connect to another Zoom
Yeah,
link, right?
Unfortunately we'll need to all log out and reconnect to the other link.
Okay.
But that's,
so when the session is over, we jump to the other Zoom link. Okay, so the next question is linked to collaborations. I think we were talking about before what good partnerships mean, but how is that we start these partnerships, these collaborations, when we want them to be good? How have they evolved in your experience in the places, the communities you work with? But also, I think another challenging question is the actual benefits. Who gets what for what, and how do we frame all that research, right? How your experiences have been about this topic? Anyone that wants to intervene first? Okay, go ahead, Jim, please.
I guess I found that last conversation sort of amazing, because from what Raina was saying and what others are saying, I thought, okay, that's all from an Aboriginal point of view. That's just all part of it. We just take that for granted. And I didn't realize it was a real issue with non-Indigenous researchers. And so I think it's when we start to looking at justice, I think for some reason, I have to keep it up here when we start talking about that sort of level. I think that's somewhere along the mutually agreed terms, free, prior and informed consent, access and benefit sharing, all that from the UN Declaration, and putting that in training. And that's a starting point to build that a justice, I think, within research. And I think that how that happens on the ground, I think then all depends on, one, the different Indigenous community, the different peoples, because we do have different perspectives. As I keep on telling researchers in Australia, there is no one pan-Aboriginal approach or Indigenous approach to solutions or issues. And I think and I think someone in their presentation that I was looking at before, yes, touched on this, that there is no one size fits all. And I think and going back to what Sarah said before, I think it was, you've got to build that time. You've got to make sure you build that time in with that into that project timeline to form those relationships. But I don't see there's certainly no easy one answer or one size fits all. That's for sure.
Thank you, Jim. I think you're very right in what you are saying. I don't know if anyone else would like to comment from their experiences. Sarah, please go ahead, and then we have Tanya. Tanya, Sarah, I think we might have to jump to the other meeting soon.
Why doesn't Tanya speak?
No, Sarah, it's fine. You go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to quickly say that I think that one of the things which is interesting to think about is the different kinds of research infrastructures that are already in place in Indigenous communities. And I think this varies a lot across the world. But in Latin America, you have institutions which are primarily representative of Indigenous people and their political aims. They don't have research capacity, but you increasingly have also research organizations which are actively having university trained and non-university trained Indigenous researchers involved in them. And I think that a good collaboration can work with either of those, but they put in different kinds of limitations and challenges to the partner.
Okay, Tanya, I think we still have time, right, Pamela? I'm sorry, I'm using you like the time keeper.
Okay, if we do have 2 minutes, I just want to, for me, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here. Good collaboration would not only involve making good relations with the Indigenous people, but then again, it's also determined by how do we not represent, but how do we present those data that we are getting right from Indigenous, like over the years that we've built this relationship with someone and we've collected these data for research purpose specifically, I'm saying, then if we are the ones who's speaking for them, like how far is their distortion, or is the I mean, how are we eligible really to present this data, or how do we present this data? Like, yeah, that's something that I was just thinking, that will that not be a part of a good collaboration to represent these data? I mean, representation is, I think, a wrong word that I'm using, but I'm just saying, how do we present these data in our research? Or yeah, that's just what I was thinking.
I think a question that you're making me think of, Tanya, with what you're saying, it's also because I think in our research protocols in general, we say we need to report back to the communities and validate what we're presenting. But sometimes I wonder to what extent, like you were saying, it's what we're presenting, it's appealing or representing them in the ways they want. What I also have found more frequently in many Indigenous communities is that they are creating their own mechanisms of accountability, precisely because I think there's been a lot of data extraction. Also, they feel a lot of misrepresentation. And I know of some examples, for example, in the US, there's like this Native Nations Institute that have developed good research protocols and what they think should be some guidelines of people, whether they are Indigenous or not. I want to work with the communities. And recently I was doing research in my own community, and I had to take a researcher from Belgium. And we were asked for the letters. I'm from the community, but they were like saying, just to let you know that we follow protocols because we have communicated with people from the same home state. Imagine that we are 570 municipalities in my home state. And they were saying, and we have in a like blacklist people that we will not allow to come back to the communities because they haven't presented results and they have pending issues with other communities. And I think that's also important to see how many communities are also creating mechanisms to prevent I don't know if I would call it like bad behavior in research. I don't know how to call it, but I think sometimes we also come with our bias. I think we should move to the next space.
We need to close. It's 11:41. I'm sorry, everyone. Thank you so much for this very lively and very relevant discussion. Thank you for to our contributors, to our conveners, to all the participants. I know there's some things hanging on the chat. I'm so sorry we couldn't cover them, but please log into the next session. And yeah, we'll see all of you there soon, hopefully. Thank you.